Hi everyone, this is BL Story of Love, the channel that tells forbidden BL stories you just can't stop listening to. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss the next ones. Liam had always lived as if a thin rope was stretched under his feet. One wrong step to the side, and down into the zone where omegas from the lower districts were usually thrown with no right to come back. By day, he carried trays in a cheap cafe near the station where the air smelled of burnt oil and other people's exhaustion. In the evenings, he worked part-time as a courier, hauling bags for those who didn't want to appear in official delivery apps. Sometimes, when the rent and bills crept toward a dangerous mark, he agreed to night shifts in clubs where omegas were paid in cash, but forced to smile even when the guests' hands became too insistent. That day, he came back from the club closer to evening. His head was buzzing from loud music, his clothes were soaked in alcohol and other people's perfume, and his sneakers had rubbed his feet raw. He dreamt only of one thing: to get home, stand under a hot shower, collapse onto the couch, and spend at least a few hours not thinking at all. His wallet in his pocket felt a bit heavier than usual, and that weight was the only comfort. A few extra bills meant that this month his mother would be able to buy her medicine instead of breaking pills in half. Near the subway entrance, the same crowd always milled around. Students, office workers, street vendors, bored police patrols standing by the ticket machines. Liam instinctively hunched his shoulders, pressed his bag to his chest, and tried to slip into the stream of people. He always tried to be invisible. Omegas like him did not benefit from attracting attention. But in a sea of people, sometimes one wrong movement is enough to send everything crashing down. The alpha in the expensive suit appeared as if from nowhere. The smell of costly cologne with a metallic hint of money hit Liam harder than any shout. The man walked as if past everyone, talking on the phone, waving his hand like the owner of the territory. He did not even notice how his shoulder slammed into Liam, shoving him back toward the wall. The hit was sharp, knocking the air out of Liam's lungs. His body reacted faster than his caution could kick in. Liam flinched, pushed the other man's hand away, just trying to regain his balance. For a split second, their eyes met. In the alpha's gaze flashed genuine outrage that someone, and an omega at that, had dared to resist. He exhaled something short and angry, and right then, behind Liam's back, a patrol officer's harsh voice sounded. The officers who had been standing at the entrance, yawning from boredom, instantly came to life. They got rare luck. A chance to publicly protect a rich citizen from a dangerous omega. After that, everything happened in a sticky fast-forward. They turned Liam to the wall, twisted his arms behind his back, and snapped cold plastic cuffs on his wrists. He tried to explain, to say it had just been a misunderstanding, but his words drowned in other people's lines. The alpha loudly complained, and the patrol was already shaping the report as aggressive behavior of an omega. Passers-by stopped, filming on their phones. Someone whispered sympathetically. Someone smirked. Someone sighed as if saying, "It's their own fault. They shouldn't argue with those above them." Inside the station house, the air felt heavier than outside. It smelled of paper, cheap coffee, and the stale sweat of people who spent their days listening to other people's stories and believing none of them. They sat Liam down at a metal table and pushed a pile of papers at him to sign. He didn't really understand what was written there. He was automatically assigned a public defender, a tired, middle-aged beta who handled dozens of such cases every day. The man flipped through the protocol, looked at Liam over his glasses, and almost without emotion gave the usual advice. Plead guilty, don't argue, hope for a lenient sentence. It's better to get a suspended term than make the judge angry, he said with a small, resigned sigh. Liam stayed silent. Liam. Everything inside him rebelled at the word guilty. He saw himself from the outside, a crumpled omega in a cheap jacket with a bruise from hitting the wall against the smooth, confident alpha with a good lawyer. Even a child could see the odds. The system always knew who to call dangerous and who to call the victim. The hearing was scheduled for the next day. The time before it stretched into a strange emptiness. They left Liam in a holding cell, where he sat on a hard bench, counting cracks on the wall. His thoughts scattered like cockroaches in the light, to his mother, whom he hadn't had time to call, to the landlady, who had long hinted she didn't keep tenants in debt, to the club, where they had probably already labeled him a problem. With every hour it became clearer. Whatever the sentence would be, there was no going back to his old life. In the morning, they took him to court. The building turned out taller than he had imagined, with cold, smooth columns and a glass facade. People in formal suits walked in and out without even glancing at those brought in from the prison van. For them, it was just background noise. For Liam, each step felt like part of the verdict. He tried to breathe evenly, but his throat tightened. The courtroom was almost full, and that surprised him. He had expected a quiet, boring hearing where his case would become just another line in a long list. Instead, the benches were filled with people holding notepads and cameras, a few activists with signs, and a couple of older women whispering to each other. In the corner, a small red light marked a local TV camera. Apparently, the story had already hit the news. Dangerous Omega attacks respected citizen in city center. He recognized the judge immediately, even though he had never seen him in person. Adrian Crawford's face appeared in reports all the time. They showed him as an example of incorruptibility and toughness. In stories about justice, they quoted his phrases about discipline, responsibility, and the need to maintain order. On screen, he always seemed collected, confident, precise. In real life, he looked the same. Controlled gestures, a direct gaze, a perfect tie knot. When Adrian sat down at the bench, the room instantly quieted. His eyes skimmed the documents, barely pausing on Liam's name. For him, it was just another case from the stack, a minor street conflict in which the aggressor and the victim were already decided in advance. The alpha in the expensive suit sat in the front row. Beside him, a lawyer who smelled of self-satisfied confidence. The lawyer whispered something reassuring into his client's ear, occasionally throwing Liam a bored look. The procedure started. The charges were read. The prosecutor, confident and smooth, described how the Omega showed unprovoked aggression, resisted lawful actions of the patrol, and created a threat to public safety. No one mentioned that the Alpha had been the first to shove him, that Liam had only tried to stay on his feet. No one said that Omegas often became targets of aggression if they failed to lower their eyes in time. The reality Liam lived in did not make it into the protocol. The public defender was given the floor as a formality. He delivered a few standard lines about Liam's difficult situation, the fact he had no prior record, and the possibility of using a milder measure. There was no fire in his voice. It was the speech of a man who had long accepted that the outcome did not depend on him. He didn't even try to break the image of the dangerous Omega the prosecution had built. They asked Liam if he pleaded guilty. Inside, everything screamed no. But the lawyer's earlier advice and the judge's heavy measuring gaze clamped his throat shut. He got stuck between the desire to defend himself and the understanding that any protest would only make things worse. It suddenly became very clear how much had been decided long before he entered this room. How little his personal truth mattered where the main goal was to send a message. This is a farce, flashed through his mind. To the courtroom, he wasn't presented as a person with a story, but as a type, an Omega from a poor district who was used to solving things with force. A couple of old administrative citations for late-night noise at clubs turned into a pattern of breaking order. The fact that he had never had the resources for real legal defense landed on the scale as some abstract risk for society. The judge listened without interrupting. He didn't ask a single question that could have changed the angle. His posture was like that of a conductor who already knows how the piece will end and is just letting the musicians finish their parts. At one point, he opened a small folder, took out a printout, and ran his eyes over the text. It was probably that internal document where Liam was just a number and a handful of characteristics. The verdict was full of familiar formulas. Society was facing growing disrespect for the law. A tough reaction was needed. It was necessary to show that even the socially vulnerable could not hide behind their status if they broke the rules. The words stacked into a neat logical construction in which the real person disappeared like paper trash in a shredder. When the gavel hit the wood, the sound was shorter than Liam had imagined. No thunderclap, no dramatic pause, just a light knock after which everything was decided. He felt his life shrink down to a few lines in a case file and a number in the prison system. His chest felt hollow, as if the air had been sucked out. This is the end, he thought coldly. For some reason, it was not the judge's face that appeared in his mind, nor the smug face of the alpha in the expensive suit, but their tiny kitchen at home. His mother sitting at the table with a mug of cheap tea, bills laid out in neat stacks, a blister pack of pills her blood pressure depended on. He could almost physically see the numbers on those papers crawling upward, the overdue notices piling up in the mailbox, the landlady, without looking, dumping their things into the stairwell. He thought about how the unpaid rent would turn into an eviction order, how his small bank account with their last savings would vanish into legal fees and fines, how his name would now stand in the database next to the label dangerous, and any attempt to find a normal job would end in a polite rejection. The world, which he had already clung to with his last strength, had officially declared him a problem. The judge's face stayed the same, impenetrable, focused, without a hint of doubt. There was no gloating and no pity in it, only a cold certainty of his own righteousness. He was doing what he always did, putting a full stop in other people's stories and calling it justice. For the public, it was just another harsh but fair sentence. Journalists were already forming headlines about a brave judge who didn't bow to Omega activists. Activists, on the contrary, were preparing posts about a repressive system. People on the benches left discussing not Liam, but the fact of another high-profile case. For Liam, it was a door into a cage where, he thought, nothing good would ever happen again. In the hallway, the guards took his arms again, put the cuffs back on, and led him down a long corridor that smelled of bleach. In his head, the usual phrases about how an Omega should be obedient, shouldn't argue, shouldn't raise his eyes, kept echoing. He felt like an object being moved from one shelf to another. He had no idea yet that this same man on the judge's bench, who had just coldly sent him to prison, would come down to his cell at night, without robe, without cameras, and approach him not as a criminal, but as a last hope. And that this meeting would destroy everything Liam thought he knew about justice, power, and the real price of any sentence. Prison met Liam as if it had been waiting for him for a long time. Cold metal bars, damp concrete walls, the heavy smell of sweat, medicine, and cheap bleach that couldn't cover the mix. The corridor was long and narrow, the guard's footsteps echoing off the walls and pounding in his temples. The keys on the ring jingled like small mocking bells. They did not take him to a general block where the air was thick with overheated bodies and bad jokes. They led him further along to a row of cells with thick doors where the air felt heavier. The guard, a tall alpha with a tired face, tossed out a short explanation without bothering to look Liam in the eye. Solitary for special cases. On paper, for his own safety, so no one would start a staged fight with the high-profile inmate. In reality, so silence and walls could do what the judge hadn't had time to finish. The cell was only a bit larger than a storage closet. A narrow metal bed bolted to the floor, a small table, a stool, a toilet behind a half wall, a tiny window almost under the ceiling with bars showing a slice of gray sky and the edge of the outer wall. In the corner, someone had once scratched a word into the concrete that was now almost impossible to read. There was something symbolic in that, an attempt to say, "I am here," erased by time and paint. Liam sat down on the bed. The mattress was thin and the springs pressed into his back. He stretched out his legs and listened. Outside, he could hear scattered sounds, someone shouting, a brief laugh, the distant clanging of a metal bowl hitting the floor. It all blended into a dull background that promised to drag on for years. The thought that the coming part of his life was limited to these walls still did not fit into his head. His mind refused to accept it as reality and clung to the feeling of a strange pause, as if everything could still be rewound. Evening slipped into night almost unnoticed. Dull orange light from a street lamp crept in through the dirty glass. Footsteps in the corridor became rarer, voices faded. The usual noisy buzz of the place shifted into another mode, thicker and heavier. Even the air seemed different. At night the walls pressed closer. Liam lay staring at the ceiling. From time to time he closed his eyes, but his body did not believe he could simply fall asleep. Every thought was chopped off by the same question. How many years? How many winters would pass before he walked outside again, if he ever did? His mother's face appeared in his mind every time. The moment she would learn about the sentence was so vivid, it made it hard to breathe. He hadn't even been able to call her himself. Some indifferent clerk would do it, if anyone did at all. When sleep finally started to creep toward him, a sound cut it off, something that just did not belong to the usual night pattern. First, he heard footsteps, not the heavy stomp of a night guard in rough boots, but a softer, more confident step of someone who was used to walking on carpet, not linoleum. This sound stood out like a wrong note in a familiar melody. Then came a smell. In prison, it smelled of everything but luxury. Yet, along with this person, the corridor seemed to fill with the faint scent of expensive cologne, paper, and cold night air from outside. With an effort, Liam pushed himself up, sat, bracing his hands on the mattress. His heart beat faster. Night visits rarely meant anything good. The lock on his cell door clicked more softly than during the day. Not as rough, not as loud. As if the person opening it didn't want the other inmates on the corridor to hear too much. The door swung open, letting in a strip of corridor light and the silhouette in the doorway. Adrian Crawford stood there. Without his robe, he looked different, but not weaker. The dark suit sat perfectly. His shoulders were just as straight, his head held slightly high. There was so much habit of command in his posture that the cell itself seemed to tense for a second and straighten its corners. No other guard came in with him. The one who opened the door stayed outside, stepping back into the shadows. That was a rule break all by itself. For a few moments they just looked at each other. Liam saw the man who a few hours earlier had measured out years of his life with a single motion of his hand, the judge whose name the news used as a synonym for harsh law. Now that same man was standing in a prison cell among gray concrete walls as if he had stepped onto foreign ground. Liam's first thought was, mistake. The second, an overlong nightmare he would soon wake up from. But the smell was too real, the shadowed lines on the judge's face too sharp to be imaginary. Adrian closed the door behind him. The click of the lock sounded different this time, short, dry, like a fixed fact. For a moment the cell felt completely cramped from the silence. It wasn't the same empty, dull silence the prison breathed. Here it was, tight and stretched between two men like a wire. When he began to speak, his voice was not the same as in the courtroom. There it had been loud, confident, honed. Here there was a rasp that microphones never caught, tiredness, strain, and something else that was harder to name. Not guilt, not remorse. More like a thin, trembling tunnel of panic running through the steel. He didn't start by justifying himself. He didn't say the sentence had been forced, that the law is harsh but fair, or that he had no choice. He didn't mention the verdict at all. Instead, he went straight to the point. He needed Liam. Not as a convict, not as an example, but as a man who knew the streets, knew how to survive among those used to crushing others, and understood the invisible routes along which omegas and betas were shuffled between rich alphas. At first it sounded like another cynical line. Liam was used to people expecting only one thing from omegas like him, to be convenient. But then, something crept into the judge's speech that Liam had never expected to hear. A personal story. Adrian said the word son as if it cut his throat. He had a child, an omega named Elias. Many years ago, before Crawford's name became a symbol of harsh justice, he had a partner, an alpha from an old elite family. In that world, an omega child was not a joy but an embarrassment. An awkward mistake. The partner left, abandoning the baby the way people discard something they don't want. Back then, Adrian made a choice he now remembered as his main sin. He hid his son. Officially, the judge had no children. His records listed only achievements. His biography was filled with long case lists. Somewhere between the lines, a dry phrase about total dedication to the law was tucked away. In reality, it meant Elias grew up off camera, off family photos, not even as a rumor. He was sent to closed schools, boarding institutions, clinics, places with high fences and thick walls where an omega could be kept locked up and still be called safe. That safety broke a few months ago. Elias disappeared. Officially, he left to study abroad on some prestigious program. The documents were perfect, with stamps and signatures. In truth, it was filthier. Elias had been taken to a private house owned by a rich alpha, Richard Vane. There, Omegas were kept like expensive toys for men whose money had long erased any breaks. Adrian didn't learn the truth at once. The system he had served for years turned on him too. The very connections he had used to build his immaculate reputation turned out to be the same threads used to pull his son into the shadows. By the time the truth surfaced, it was too late. The official papers already said Elias had left voluntarily. Any attempt to raise a scandal would become an admission of his own lies. The judge understood. One careless move, and his career, his status, his perfection would collapse. But along with them would fall the last bit of protection he could offer his son, at least on paper. This knowledge rang in his voice like a crack in glass. A man who had always believed in the law was saying that this time, the law couldn't help him. He couldn't go to the police. They would first dig up the files on his secret child and ask why he had hidden him all these years. He couldn't go to his fellow judges. They would see not a desperate father, but a weak spot they could later use against any of his stern speeches. He had to admit that this time, the official system was not only powerless, but deadly for the one he wanted to save. "I need someone outside the system," he said then, low, rough, almost in a whisper. He described Vane's house the way people describe a beast's lair they know only from rumor. A private mansion behind high walls, guards trained to look through people. Rooms where Omegas were kept like expensive inventory. Parties where men with names that politics and business depended on gathered, and where no one called real police because too many important people could be in the same hall on the same night. You could not walk into that world through the front door with a warrant, but new guests were brought in there all the time from the same low places Liam came from. The offer that followed was really just another sentence in different packaging. On paper, Liam's conviction would stand. His name would remain in the prison system, his cell occupied by someone else. In reality, they were going to use him as cover. They would transfer him to a special regime, run him through on paper as part of some secret behavior correction program, and then send him into Vane's house as yet another Omega someone had bought and brought in. The task sounded simple only in words. Get inside, find Elias, gain at least a shred of trust and figure out if escape was possible. If not, at least get enough information out to act later. All that is with no weapon, no official support, and no right to make a mistake. In return, they promised a lot. To overturn the sentence, clean his record, protect his mother, give financial help, a chance to start a new life in another place with another job, and no dangerous Omega stamp. The promises rolled out smoothly, like an expensive commercial. Liam knew how easily such words evaporated. Inside, anger and exhaustion rose at the same time. The man who had used his fate as a public gesture just hours earlier was now standing in his cell and asking for help. Not offering to atone, asking to use an Omega one more time, but now in the name of what he called rescue. He wanted to say, find someone else. Wanted to shrug it off and turn his face to the wall, to say his life had been used enough already. But in the judge's voice, under all the layers of cold logic, there was another sound. Not fear for his career, not horror at a possible scandal, real, almost physical panic of a father who knew his child had become a thing in someone else's hands. Liam recognized that tone too well. He had been a thing himself. He knew what it was like when your body and your voice turned into someone else's territory, into merchandise. Putting himself in Elias's place was scarier than imagining another stretch in prison. Suddenly, there was too much of his own reflection in that stranger's fate. The cell was cramped with breathing, with heavy words, with the invisible deal already hanging in the air. Liam felt that thin rope under his feet pull tight again. Only now, a wrong step could cost not just his own life, but the life of an Omega his father had hidden so thoroughly, he had almost erased him from his biography. The decision had not yet formed into words, but the situation was painfully clear. Prison meant a slow, predictable end stretched across years. Vane's house meant a quick, possibly final risk. But there, unlike in concrete walls, someone was suffering even more than he was, and much more than his own sentence depended on how he answered that night. The decision did not hit him like lightning. It crept up slowly, like the cold along the concrete floor. The morning after the judge's night visit dragged thick and slow. Daylight slipped into the cell in a narrow stripe near the ceiling, but changed nothing. Liam sat on the bed, his chin on his knees, and replayed what he'd heard over and over. Elias's soft, unfamiliar name had already latched onto his mind, as if he'd known the guy since childhood. He remembered the stories he had heard in back kitchens and alleyways, stories about closed houses where Omegas were taken for work. On the outside, columns, manicured lawns, charity events. Inside, rooms with no door handles, cameras in the corners, alphas for whom another person's body was just entertainment. Sometimes someone came back from there no longer resembling themselves. More often, they didn't come back at all. Now, in every one of those images, the blurred silhouette was replaced by a specific face he had never actually seen. The quiet, hidden son of the judge, growing up as a shadow in his father's biography. An Omega who had lived as a mistake from birth and now had become a toy for men whose names the law itself shielded, the law his father had served his entire life. Liam understood that he was being used again, that the very fact of this secret agreement made him disposable. No one had promised that, if he succeeded, they would truly let him go. No one could guarantee Vane's house wouldn't be the last address of his life. Yet, for the first time in years, there was a choice in front of him that wasn't just about himself. Staying and rotting in concrete was familiar. Going where even the police wouldn't go for the sake of an unknown Omega, that sounded insane. And that insanity slowly started to feel like the only truly living option. By evening, when footsteps filled the corridor again, he already knew what he would say. When the door opened and Adrian's heavy silhouette appeared in the doorway again, Liam stood, his legs shaking, and cut through his own fear with just 2 words. "I'll do it." The judge nodded as if he'd heard not a heroic act, but a long-expected confirmation. A too quick flash of gratitude appeared in his eyes, too fast to hide, and it made Liam almost sick. The man who had shattered his life with one strike of the gavel was now looking at him as his last chance. The paperwork for the transfer took only a few days. On paper, it looked like inclusion in an experimental program for socially dangerous Omegas, aimed at behavior correction in preparation for controlled labor. The documents named some neutral correctional center on the outskirts of the city with high fences and a modest emblem. In reality, they took him to a small closed complex hidden between warehouse districts and suburban highways. The building looked like something between a clinic and a boarding house. White walls, corridors that were too clean, and the smell of antiseptic faintly mixed with expensive coffee from the staff room. There were windows, but they opened onto an internal courtyard enclosed by a high fence. Officially, they worked here with those society considered a problem. Unofficially, they prepared people like Liam for missions no report would ever mention. The first person he met there was a beta trainer named Nate. Middle-aged, short hair, a steady voice without extra harshness. He did not smile but didn't look at Liam like a dirt either. In a dry tone, he explained. His job was to teach Liam how to hold himself the way rich alphas expected to see an Omega. Submissive, but not pathetic. Quiet, but not completely broken. The kind of convenient gray shadow people quickly get used to and stop noticing. Training started with simple things. How to stand when someone is shouting at you. How to keep your gaze lowered but not terrified so as not to excite those who like breaking the strong. How not to flinch at the first shove so you don't show instinctive resistance. It was a strange, inside-out discipline. They taught him not to defend himself, but to surrender correctly, pushing his real reaction deep inside. At the same time, a doctor, an alpha with a tired face and a pale ring mark on his finger, checked his health. Liam was used to free clinics where no one really looked at him and just wrote out cheap painkillers. Here they ran him through tests, scans, stress assessments. They explained that Vane's house did not tolerate anyone who looked sick or worn out. A toy had to look elite, even if bought from the gutter. Smell was another topic. In a world where secondary traits meant more than an ID, people expected a certain chemistry from an Omega. The doctor carefully adjusted his blockers and neutralizers so Liam's natural scent would blur but not disappear. They talked about diet changes so his body would respond predictably. Under his skin settled a new understanding. Wherever they intended to send him, he would enter not as a person, but as a carefully tuned set of reactions. The etiquette consultant, a dry beta with a perfect manicure, handled the rest. He taught Liam how to move in rooms where every gesture could be read as an invitation or refusal, how to hold a glass without spilling, even if cold sweat was running down his back, how to speak briefly so as not to reveal too much but not seem stupid, how to laugh at other people's jokes without showing contempt. That part infuriated Liam the most. It was pure, polished lie, the kind that always clung to the rich. Sometimes it felt like they truly were remaking him for someone else's storefront, sanding, repainting, adjusting. In the mirror, Nate kept turning toward him. He saw the same boy from the lower districts, only with a straighter back and a slightly different gaze. But inside, another cold layer was forming, the part of him that would observe everything while the rest played its role. In the few free minutes he had, Liam sat by the window and stared at the narrow strip of sky above the yard wall. Nate brought him folders, building layouts, photos of facades, lists of names. They explained how such places worked, how, under the guise of clubs for the chosen, they gathered financiers, politicians, and mob bosses. How Omegas were taken out to events where no one would dare call the real police, because you could find representatives of many agencies in the same room. They spent extra time on Richard Vane's name. On paper, he looked almost respectable. Charity projects, patronage, committee work. Only between the lines were hints of underground auctions, vanished witnesses, closed cases. The house where Elias was kept was listed as a private residence outside the city, with security on par with government facilities. They told Liam honestly, if anything went wrong, no one would make it in time. Adrian appeared rarely. In the training complex, he looked out of place, like a piece of a marble courthouse accidentally dropped here. Each visit sent a kind of electric shiver through the staff. Guards straightened up, the etiquette consultant grew even stiffer, the doctor became more official. With Liam, the judge spoke little, but each time he looked at him as though trying to see his son through him. He didn't ask about posture or how well Liam had learned the rules. He cared about something else. Could Liam endure an environment where Omegas were seen only as things? Could he stay intact long enough to reach Elias? Once, staying longer than usual, Adrian stood by the window in the small office where they reviewed Vane's house plans. He was staring at the gray yard, as if seeing, instead, an old garden from his youth, where he might have walked with his son if he had allowed himself to be just a father. In profile, he looked older than on court tribunes. Less granite, more exhaustion. In that moment, Liam clearly felt a bitter irony. The one who had spent years publicly breaking Omegas with sentences and bans now found himself locked inside his own fears, just as they were locked in their cells. His power had fallen on those with no protection, but it was useless against the private doors of rich alphas' houses. And the only key he had to those doors was the Omega he himself had sent to prison to show society his toughness. Preparation dragged on for weeks. His body got used to new clothes, to certain smells, to the schedule. His mind got used to the idea that soon these rehearsals would turn into his only way to survive among people who saw his life as a statistical error. At some point, the thought of prison no longer frightened him the same way. Compared to where he was going, the cell suddenly seemed honest. At least it didn't pretend to be anything but a cage. On the day they gave him a new outfit already tailored for the role of a Club Omega, everything finally clicked into place. The fabric fit too well. The scent of fabric softener and faint perfume irritated him. In the mirror, he saw a guy who would easily fit into a soft armchair in a rich house with a smile on his lips and empty eyes. Liam watched that reflection until he finally saw what he needed. Behind the carefully constructed shell, behind the rehearsed gestures and submissive posture, there was still that dark, hard stripe inside him that had once made him jerk back in the subway. It hadn't gone anywhere. It had just learned to wait. He understood. They were not just leading him into hell, into someone else's hell, built by other people's rules, with other people's money. But for the first time in his life, He was stepping into that hell not as a random victim, but as someone who at least knew why he was crossing the threshold. The evening when they brought him to Richard Vane's mansion felt like a border between worlds from the very start. The car drove slower and slower, the tires whispering over gravel until they stopped at the gate. Metal closed behind them with a dull, vibrating thud that sent a chill down Liam's spine. It wasn't the sound of an ordinary gate, more like a cell door closing, only with expensive finishing. From the outside, the house looked flawless. High white walls, glass surfaces reflecting warm light, neatly trimmed shrubs, a fountain working even at this hour, exactly like in magazines about successful people who love privacy. But even before he stepped over the threshold, the air changed. Through the faint scent of pine and fresh-cut grass seeped a heavy, sticky mix of expensive alcohol, spicy perfume, tobacco smoke, and something else. The bitter note of worn-out patience that always lingers where people are kept longer than promised. They led him out of the car, not roughly, but in a way that immediately defined his role. Nate, the beta handler from the center, the one who had been turning him into a convenient shadow for weeks, walked ahead. He spoke to the guards briefly, flat-voiced. His tone made it clear this was not the first or last time he brought goods here. Liam was introduced as an Omega who had lost everything, owed everyone, and was now ready to accept any conditions for a roof and food. The story was simple, believable, and dirty enough to match the house owner's tastes. The guards were just as laconic. Two alphas in perfectly tailored suits with equally cold eyes checked the documents, ran a scanner over him, and gave him a cursory visual inspection. One of them held Liam's chin a fraction of a second longer than necessary, studying his face. Where another Omega might have flinched, Liam stayed still. Inside, everything tightened, but the training had stuck. He had learned how to fall inward, leaving his body on autopilot. Inside, the house was even bigger than it seemed from outside. A high, marble-floored hall where footsteps and chandelier lights reflected. Art on the walls, not screaming, but quietly expensive paintings radiating accumulated taste and boredom. Somewhere deeper, soft jazz played, only as a backdrop to laughter and clinking glasses. In the main hall, a group was gathering. Alphas in expensive suits, a few betas serving them. Omegas were already in position, soft, smiling, perfect. There were fewer of them than Liam expected, about a dozen. Each one looked like they'd stepped out of a glossy magazine. Perfect skin, sleek hair, flawless figures. Jewelry on their necks, thin bracelets on their wrists, both accessories and marks of ownership. They moved among the guests like a rehearsed troupe, topping up drinks, offering cigarettes, leaning just enough that someone could touch their necks. Their smiles were all the same, as if drawn. But their eyes differed. In them, the house's hidden truth showed through. Exhaustion, compressed anxiety, long-learned obedience. The house steward, a tall beta named Martin, accepted Liam like a new item. His voice held no sympathy, only businesslike assessment. He quickly outlined the rules. Speak only when spoken to, stay close to the other Omegas, always remain in sight, never argue with guests, and especially never contradict the owner. The words, "No one is forcing you to stay, you can leave whenever you want," were tossed in for show without any real belief. They floated in the air like another decorative phrase in a house where doors really existed only one way. "Smile," Martin added as he led him toward the hall. Liam obediently lifted the corners of his mouth. The smile was exactly the one they'd practiced, not too bright, so as not to attract extra attention, and not too faint so as not to arouse suspicion. Inside, a frozen column of ice pressed against his throat, but outside, he looked like just another Omegalong used to his role. Richard Vane did not appear immediately. At first, the house ran on its own. Guests discussed deals, argued about politics, traded news of people's downfalls and sudden rises. Omegas quietly greased the gears of this talking machine. Liam moved among them, listening. He caught fragments about someone who had burned out and had to be let go, about what fresh blood had arrived at another house, about how half of informal agreements now rest on Omegas. In all of it, Omegas were a resource, never people. When the owner finally entered, the house itself reacted. The noisy hum dipped for a heartbeat. The music seemed to step back. Several alphas straightened up. Vane walked in calmly, unhurried, in a flawless black suit with no flashy detail. His allure was not in his looks, but in the calm, predatory air that prickled skin. His scent blended expensive tobacco, light woody cologne, and that special chill of power you can't mistake. He didn't look at Omegas as people, more like at a collection he had long since gotten used to admiring. His voice was low, without sharp swings, with a lazy note common to those who are sure the world has belonged to them for a long time. After Martin quietly informed him that a promising new Omega had arrived, Vane allowed himself a brief interest. They brought Liam closer. For a moment, he had to withstand the owner's direct stare. That was a test of fear, submissiveness, his readiness to break. Inside, everything shrank, but he lowered his eyes just enough to show respect and dependence. Not too deeply, so as not to look completely shattered. Not too boldly, so as not to give even a hint for aggression. Vane's fingers, cool with perfectly manicured nails, touched Liam's chin and lifted his face. The touch was almost gentle, and that made it worse. He studied Liam in silence, like a lot on an auction. Liam felt sticky fear creeping down his spine. One wrong move, and they would send him straight to the bedroom, skipping all intermediate steps. He recalled his training and focused on his breathing, allowing himself just one small, scripted whisper. "Thank you, sir." That was enough. Vane gave a short, joyless smirk and muttered that the faces from up top are boring already, and this one still has some life. He ordered Martin to keep Liam in the general hall for now, to watch him and let him get used to the house. It was a reprieve, not a rescue. But even that meant a lot. Liam did not see Elias that night. There were too many lights, too much laughter, and too many eyes. Real trophies are rarely put on display for everyone. Their first brief contact happened a few days later, when the house seemed to have relaxed, accepting Liam as part of the scenery. That day the mansion ran on a quieter setting. There were hardly any guests, just a couple of regular alphas in the study and some private consultations in side rooms. Liam was sent upstairs to one of the inner wings to bring a tray of drinks to a doctor who regularly visited the special guest. The corridors there were different. Fewer paintings, more neutral smooth walls, cameras in the corners, soft, almost clinical light. When one of the doors opened, Liam automatically lowered his eyes like he'd been taught. But out of the corner of his eye, he caught an image that would later come back in his dreams. By the window stood a thin figure. Light hair falling over his forehead, pale skin. His clothes were simpler than what other Omegas wore. A soft sweater, loose pants, no jewelry. The doctors were talking to him in soothing, measured tones, but he didn't seem to hear them. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the glass where the garden darkened, not empty and not full of panic. More like dimmed, the look of someone who has lived for a long time in a world where his wishes mean nothing. "Elias," the doctor said softly, addressing him by name, and that sound made something click inside Liam. The name locked into all the images he had been carrying since that night in the cell. The judge's son stopped being a legend and became a real body in a real room. Their eyes met for barely a second. Almost by accident, Liam didn't have time to smile or gesture. He just saw how, for the briefest moment, surprise flickered in Elias's eyes. Not hope, not joy. A quiet realization that the person in the doorway was not a doctor, not a guard, not a guest. An Omega. Someone at his own level. Someone looking not from above and not from below, but straight at him. Then the door closed, cutting off sound, scent, and the picture. The days that followed grew even denser. Vane's house turned out to be built like a perfectly tuned machine. Every corridor had its function, every door its access mode. Omegas lived in a separate wing, in rooms that at first glance could have belonged to a cozy hotel. Soft beds, warm blankets, polite staff. But the windows either didn't open or looked onto the inner yard sealed off from the world by a wall. The doors could always be opened from inside, but there was nowhere to go. At night, Liam lay on his narrow bed listening to the house breathe. Somewhere above, muffled music came from Vane's private rooms. In the neighboring rooms, soft steps, muted sobs, whispers cut off the moment someone's shoes clicked in the corridor. Deeper in the house, other sounds sometimes leaked out, brief cries, strangled moans, nervous laughter. The house lived like an organism feeding on other people's reactions. By day, he continued to learn how to be part of that organism. He learned when to move closer to guests and when to dissolve into the decor. He memorized which regulars liked to break people and which preferred buying long-term gratitude. He caught last names, club names, other houses' names. In passing, he counted cameras and mapped out blind spots where the watcher's gaze wasn't as dense. For now, it was only a rough sketch of someone else's map of hell, but the longer he stayed, the more he realized. No one would be dragged out of here by brute force. He didn't see Elias directly again. Only sometimes heard doctor's footsteps in that same corridor, or noticed Martin personally heading into the closed wing where not the Omegas for guests lived, but the personal trophies. The house guarded that part of itself jealously. Only a few had access there. Listening to the locks click, Liam understood. Reaching Elias would be far harder than just walking down a hallway with a tray. Every evening, back in his staff room, he thought about the same thing. Vane's house held people not only with locks, cameras, and money, it held them with an idea that outside there was only another house just like this, that beyond this luxurious cell there was no place where an Omega could be anything but a toy or a tool. To get Elias out, it wouldn't be enough to one day open the door. First, he would have to do the impossible, convince someone who had lived too long in someone else's hell that there was anything at all beyond it that wasn't built for someone else's power. Direct conversations were impossible. Any attempt at unscripted interaction would show up instantly on camera feeds, in reports, in the guards' moods. But silence can be full too. Liam started using it as a tool. He found moments when he could speak out loud in places where he was officially not being monitored. In the staff changing room, where cameras were supposedly off. In the corridor, when he walked alongside another Omega, and behind the thin wall, Elias's room lay. He didn't tell full stories, but little fragments. He talked about cheap coffee from a stall by the subway, the kind that didn't smell like vanilla and premium beans, but like bitterness and the freedom to choose whether to buy it or just walk past. About the roar of the underground trains where no one cares who is Alpha, who is Omega, who is Beta, because everyone is just trying to catch their train. About small neighborhoods where evening doesn't mean a reception, but a neighbor taking out the trash in a stretched-out sweater. He never said Elias's name, never specified who he was talking to. He just spoke as if to himself, a little louder than the situation required. Sometimes Martin threw him an irritated look as if saying, "Enough talking." But usually those words dissolved into the everyday noise. Behind the door he wasn't allowed to look at. The air always seemed to get thicker. Liam could hear it in the way footsteps changed rhythm, in a slightly deeper sigh, in the faint creak of a bed. Someone in there was listening. Elias reacted very carefully, not with big surges, but tiny shifts. One evening, when Omegas from the common wing were being led down the hallway for medical checks, he turned his head just a fraction toward the place Liam's voice was coming from, paused for a split second, as if listening, then walked on, but his steps didn't look fully mechanical anymore. That tiny, almost invisible hesitation meant he had caught on to those words. Liam understood that trust doesn't grow from one glance and a couple of phrases. Not for someone who had been taught for years that any offer of help is just a new form of chains. So he worked with what he had, with the other Omegas and the staff. He started noticing who in the house was weaker, more vulnerable. The one who was always sent on the most degrading errands, the one kept behind after the parties to clean up not only the glasses but the aftermath of other people. The one who shook at the sound of a certain guest's footsteps. Liam wasn't a savior. He couldn't cancel Vane's orders, but he could take on part of the weight no one here considered important. He picked up extra shifts when he saw another Omega barely making it to bed, took a heavy tray out of someone's trembling hands before an Alpha could notice it as unprofessional, swapped places in the line to the doctor with someone who was especially scared that day if the guards looked too irritated. He did it without speeches, without making a show. Just acted as if that was how it was supposed to be. These small things didn't go unnoticed. The Omegas didn't say thank you out loud. But the way they started sitting closer to him in the common room, how they slid a plate with an extra piece of bread his way, how they let their hand rest on his shoulder for a second, all of that spoke clearly enough. In their whispered conversations, a new contour appeared. Liam wasn't just the new one. Liam was the one who didn't push when he didn't have to. Rumors in places like this travel faster than orders from security. Stories about how he stepped in, how he took a punishment onto himself, how he drew a guest's attention away from an Omega already at the breaking point, reached even the rooms where the voices from the common wing never carried. Even if Elias didn't see it with his own eyes, he heard about it. From a chatty nurse. From an Omega who came to therapy with tight lips and shaking hands. From a casual line in a corridor, dropped by someone who no longer knew how to keep quiet. Gradually, a strange, invisible link formed between them. They almost never crossed paths in a literal sense. No walks together, no shared evenings, no casual talks by the window. But each of them knew that somewhere in this carefully constructed hell, there was another person who remembered how the outside world sounds, and who was ready, if it came to it, to reach out. Liam saw clearly. For escape, this alone wasn't enough. Any attempt to physically drag Elias out without his inner agreement would turn everything into just another kidnapping, only from the opposite side. Then, the judge would get a son who would see him as a new jailer, not a rescuer. Then, the whole operation would become a copy of what Vane and his guests had already done to him. And the house would win. Even if the door one day opened, so for the first half of his work, he focused not on escape routes and bribing staff, though he quietly worked on that too. The main goal was different. He had to prove to Elias, not with speeches but by the fact of his presence, that at least one person in this house didn't see him as a toy. That at least one person was ready to look at him not as a rare trophy, but as an ally. Only then the word "let's go" would stop sounding like another order and become what it had to be. An offer to step into a world too scary to imagine, but even scarier never to try. While Liam was slowly moving deeper into the workings of Vane's house, on the outside, Adrian was still living inside his carefully built stage set. Every day he put on several masks at once, and each of them fit almost like skin. Morning began in an empty apartment. No children's things, no second mug set at the table, just perfectly measured order. On a shelf in his study stood a frame with an official photo. Judge Adrian Crawford in his robe, shaking hands with the mayor, cameras flashing. The real, living photos were hidden deeper, in a safe behind the shelves. A few faded pictures gathered dust there, a boy with light hair and a thick sweater, with a cautious smile that already showed the habit of not taking up too much space. Every morning, Adrian walked past that shelf and never opened the safe. That, too, was part of the mask. He entered the courthouse composed, controlled down to each gesture. Staff greeted him in the hallway. Reporters smiled politely, seizing a chance to toss him a question about principles of justice toward Omegas. He answered with phrases so rehearsed that others could have said them for him, about discipline, about order, about how equal status doesn't mean freedom from responsibility. Each word hit home like a bullet in a target. In the courtroom, he looked flawless. Straight back, cold voice, decisions built like a well-tuned machine. The Omegas brought before his bench saw only this shell. For them, he was the face of a system that never doubts itself. They heard the sentence and broke already from the fact that there wasn't a single space left where their voice meant anything. Inside Adrian, something scratched silently at his ribs every time. Before, he could hide behind a comfortable formula. This is needed for public order. Now, knowing where his own son was spending his nights, that formula turned into a badly muffled hum of lies. Each time he pronounced a harsh sentence on an Omega, he saw not only the defendant before him, but strange hands on Elias's wrists. The phrase, threat to public safety in his own ears, sounded like convenient sacrifice. He knew he couldn't just abruptly change his behavior. If he suddenly became softer, began acquitting Omegas or releasing them, Vane and the people around him would smell something wrong immediately. A tough judge who preached discipline yesterday and started talking about compassion today would not look enlightened. He would look compromised. Any crack in his image meant not only the end of his career, but a direct threat to Elias. His son would instantly become a pressure point, so Adrian kept playing the role. He stood in front of cameras, gave comments about the inadmissibility of street unrest among Omegas, signed off on new registration rules, took part in closed meetings with politicians where even tougher control measures were discussed. Every such step felt like a bullet in his own foot, but he took it consciously, holding the mask in place. At the same time, he tried to hit Vane where he would expect it least. In his office, behind a thick door reporters never got past, Adrian signed requests to the tax service, supported initiatives to audit charity funds that Vane used to move money. He nudged anti-corruption committees toward his name, revisited old cases involving Vane's partners, carefully choosing wordings that looked like a fight for system purity, not personal revenge. The pushback was almost immediate. Files stalled, disappeared, reappeared with notes about insufficient grounds. Colleagues he used to speak to half-voiced about professional issues suddenly started talking too loudly and too pointedly, avoiding certain topics. Hints slipped more and more often into conversations. Some people are getting too carried away chasing private sectors. Maybe they need reminding of their place. The net around Vane was tight. Judges whose campaigns he had funded, prosecutors whose families vacationed at his private resorts, politicians quietly taking his donations. Any direct blow at him triggered a chain reaction in which Adrian's name was near the top of the risk list. He understood that he couldn't take this structure down head-on. Not now. Not alone. One of the hardest days came when a file landed on his desk that he himself had requested. It was a summary of Omega cases over the past several years that had passed through his courtroom. A statistical report, a dry internal document. He flipped pages and saw not numbers, but faces. An Omega sentenced for assaulting an Alpha in a bar where cameras somehow never recorded how the fight began. A young courier caught in a clash between two Alpha groups and logged as an instigator because he had tried to call for help. An Omega from a poor area who forged a work pass to get into a clinic that refused to treat him. His signature stood under each case, clear, confident strokes in black ink. Where the verdict read exemplary punishment, he now heard fear of losing status. Where it said a firm signal to society is needed, he heard willingness to break a real person for the convenience of the system. He put the folder aside, walked over to the window, and leaned his hands on the sill. The city hummed below in its usual low register. Cars, crowds, neon signs. For the first time, it became genuinely hard to breathe. I did the same thing, he stated coldly to himself. The same mechanism that kept Elias locked up was fed by people like him. Only the scenery was different. In one place, an Omega was turned into a thing in Vane's private house. In another, into a number in court statistics. His thoughts kept circling back to Liam. He knew less about him than he would have liked. Only age, background, a brief summary of the case, and a few lines from the handler. An Omega from the lower districts, with no ties, no protection, supporting a mother with rent and medicine. A man whose life he had personally crushed into the frame of a sentence, then used that sentence as cover. At first he tried to justify himself, if only in his own head. Told himself, I gave him a chance instead of a cell. I offered him a way out of the system not through a complaint, but through action. Those phrases sounded logical, like a well-written contract. But as his private war with Vane dragged on, any justification rang hollower and hollower. To keep from losing control completely, he built another layer of protection, a handler network. The handler, a beta with years of work and special units behind him, had been recommended by people you didn't pose with in official photos. His name was Marcus, and he could blend into someone else's space as easily as others could take over a room. On paper, Marcus was an employee of a department supervising private institutions. In reality, his task was to be eyes and ears where a judge couldn't show up. Adrian set up a separate channel. No names, only codes. No familiar messengers, only encrypted packets in a system he still had access to from an old, long-frozen case. He waited for each message like a verdict. Marcus's reports were dry and concise. Subject to Liam integrating into Vane household system, seen servicing closed evenings. Subject Elias remains isolated, but shows hidden interest in any mention of outside world. Visual contact between subjects established, indirect signs of minimal trust. A couple of lines, a few phrases, but for Adrian they held whole scenes he was forced to fill in with imagination. He pictured softly lit corridors built to hide, not reveal. Pictured Liam pretending not to see other people's pain so as not to betray his own. Pictured a son who didn't know that every breath he took was being logged in a secret file. Each report brought a double feeling. On one hand, the plan was moving. Elias wasn't broken completely. Liam hadn't vanished into the system. He hadn't become a nameless shadow. A connection was forming between them, the only thing that could eventually become a channel for escape. On the other hand, Adrian saw more clearly what he'd done. He had turned Liam into a tool and pushed him under fire, continuing the same logic he now fought against inside. Only the goal had changed. Before, he broke Omegas for ambitious Alpha's peace of mind. Now, for his own child's safety. But in both cases, someone else paid with their body and mind for his decisions. On the worst nights, he sat in his home office without the overhead light, just the desk lamp, the stacks of case files, the photos in the safe he still didn't touch. The silence pressed harder than any courtroom debate. In that silence, there was nothing to distract him from what he had to admit, that the line he was walking wouldn't go on forever. Sooner or later, the secret would surface. Someone from Vane's side would realize the new Omega had arrived too conveniently. Someone in the Handler network would notice a judge's strange focus on one particular house. Some enemy would put together the puzzle of his harsh public stance and hidden moves. In any of those scenarios, the price would be high. A public scandal, investigations, old cases dragged out into the light with his signature under each broken life. The truth about a son who had, officially, never existed. The fact of a secret deal with a convicted Omega whom he pulled out of prison not for justice, but for family. Sometimes a bitterly sarcastic thought flashed, "That's exactly what I deserve." But then he'd see Elias's and Liam's faces in his mind. They didn't deserve to have their lives crushed just because he had finally decided to be honest, so he pulled the mask on again. In the morning, he stepped up to cameras and said the same old words. In court, he issued the same kind of sentences. In closed offices, he played cautious political games, pretending he didn't care how the next audit of Vane's fund ended. Only one element in this structure remained out of his control, the inner voice that grew louder every day, telling him, "Be ready to pay, not only with your career, status, and name. When the time comes, you'll have to answer not just for what you're doing now to save your son, but for all the sentences with which you once justified the system." Adrian already understood. Even if the operation with Liam and Elias succeeded, the story wouldn't end there. Secrets never stay buried forever. And the bill for years of silent complicity would be presented sooner or later. The only question was whether he'd managed to pay it himself before the world tried to collect it from the very people he was so desperate to protect. The atmosphere in Vane's house started changing almost invisibly. First, one of the regular party nights simply disappeared from the schedule. Then, a second. Then, staff began whispering about a new project and negotiations that required Richard's personal presence in the city and abroad. For most, that just meant changing shifts and stress from uncertainty. For Liam, it was the first real crack in what had seemed like a solid wall. When Vane was away, the house sounded different. The heavy, pressing background of his presence vanished, that subtle tension in the air you could feel even behind closed doors. The guards loosened their shoulders, the waitstaff allowed themselves to speak a little louder, the Omegas breathed freer, even if they tried not to show it. Control shifted to his deputy, a middle-aged man named Matthew, who loved expensive alcohol more than order. His voice always carried a drunk undertone. He liked the feel of power, but hated working for it. Liam started tracking these changes as carefully as he'd once memorized patrol schedules in his neighborhood. He marked when Vane usually drove into the city, at what hour Matthew tipped over from control into drunkenness, which corridors' cameras and human eyes checked less frequently at those times. Day by day, the map of the house in his head became not just spatial, but temporal. The same places felt different in the morning, during the day, and late at night. He dissected security the same way. Some guards clearly enjoyed their power over the Omegas. Their voices rang with cold satisfaction every time they humiliated someone, and Liam didn't even try to approach them. Others just did their jobs, clinging to steady paychecks in fear of losing them. Their tone was flat and polished. They tried not to think about the fact that they were guarding a system of abuse, not a home. And then there were a few whose voices carried weariness and, unexpectedly, a thin note of doubt. The night driver, a beta named Jaden, belonged to that last category. Liam had noticed him in his first weeks. Jaden arrived a little earlier than his shift and left a little later than required. He didn't flirt with Omegas, didn't make crude jokes, and called them by name even when the house owner labeled them with nicknames based on their looks. Old, uneven scars covered his hands, not salon scars, but street ones that had healed without doctors. In his conversations with staff, fragments slipped out about cheap motels, long roads, nights where you had to choose between safety and money. Liam started with small things. A few times he helped Jaden unload luggage even though it wasn't in his job description. Once he handed him a bottle of water right on time when the driver returned from the city after a long trip with a particularly demanding guest. Another night, he swapped an Omega on a list who was in no condition to be sent out, quietly changing the names. It all looked like simple attentiveness, but gradually it piled up as a small reserve of trust. The turning point came one night when a guest, drunk and high, made a scene at the gate. He shouted, demanded more entertainment, accused the staff of not trying hard enough. Jaden, outwardly calm, managed the situation, moved the car, and kept him from smashing into the gate or the Omegas in the driveway. When it was over and the yard finally emptied out, Liam ended up beside him for just a couple of seconds. "You're not from their world," Liam said quietly, not accusing, but stating a fact. Jaden gave a short smirk and replied, "And you hear too much." The exchange was brief, but it held the key thing. Both recognized each other as outsiders in a house where many thought this way of life was normal. Their later conversations got longer, but not more revealing. Caution had been hammered into both of them. In bits and pieces, Liam learned that Jaden had worked for people like Vane before and had seen how houses for the elite turned into traps where not only Omegas disappeared, but betas too, if they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jaden didn't pretend to be a hero. On the contrary, he admitted openly that he held on to the job because he had a family to feed, a family no one in this house would ever hear about. Even so, when Liam cautiously mentioned yet again that some things here did not look safe, Jaden didn't brush him off. "If they catch you, I won't be there to help," he said one night, staring into the dark yard as if talking to the shadows. "I know," Liam replied. And it was exactly that honesty, with no promises and illusions, that made their connection stronger than any oaths. Through small favors and neutral questions, Liam began piecing together a puzzle Jaden himself didn't fully see. Exactly where the camera by the service entrance was installed, whose wiring glitched regularly. At what hours delivery trucks came and went, their vehicles automatically added to the access system. How often they called real ambulances, and when they used private medical teams instead, the ones they worked with under unwritten deals. At the same time, he was drawing closer to Elias. Now that Vane was away more often, the judge's son spent slightly less time under his direct eye. They still didn't let him out to guests without special need, but sometimes allowed him short walks in the garden early in the morning when most of the house was still asleep. Liam began arranging his own routine so that, by chance, he'd be nearby at that time, not intrusively at a distance, as if just running errands. He noticed how Elias's walk changed. At first, it had been pure mechanics, steps even, without pauses, like a person who knows exactly where every turn is. Then, tiny hesitations started to appear. Half a second at the fence, a hand lingering on a tree trunk, breathing in the smell of fresh air just a little longer than necessary. These were microscopic signs of life the house system tried to burn out, and Liam, on the contrary, quietly fed. He kept talking out loud about things outside, as if speaking to no one. About how in the mornings market sellers shouted over each other trying to convince people to buy their bread. About buskers in the subway who occasionally played so well that people slowed down, even when late for work. About cheap cafes where the coffee tasted awful, but no one touched you without your consent. Once, walking past, he heard a barely audible whisper behind him. The subway. Is it loud? The question was so soft it could have been mistaken for wind, but to Liam it sounded like thunder. It was the first time Elias had reacted to his words directly, allowing himself to feel interest in a world he'd never been let into. Very, Liam replied just as quietly, without turning. But you get to choose where to get off. Nothing more was needed. A fragile thread had been tied. Elias had shown that he was listening, and Liam had shown that he could answer without pressing, without demanding anything. The core of the escape plan was born where these two lines intersected, Jaden's knowledge and Elias's slowly returning sense of self. Liam knew that dragging someone out of Vane's house by force was almost impossible. Any attempt to storm the gates would end in blood, and in Vane instantly pulling all his strings. There was only one kind of vehicle that always got through here without too many questions: the ambulance. He remembered how, during training at the center, they had explained, in closed houses for the elite, medical staff were always in a gray zone. On one hand, they were valued for usefulness. On the other, hated for reminding people how fragile bodies are. But most importantly, their vehicles were treated as necessity. No one would check a stretcher too carefully if an Omega on it had a seizure. Liam decided to use that. The first tests were cautious. He staged a controlled fainting spell for one of the Omegas at the most inconvenient moment for Matthew, when the deputy was half drunk and there were still a few important guests in the house. A bit of noise, a little panic, a few loud words about the house being responsible for staff health, and the ambulance was called without argument. Liam watched closely how security and staff reacted, which documents they filled out, who met the paramedics, how long the vehicle sat in the yard with its doors open. Through Jaden and Adrian's outside network, extra pieces fell into place. Marcus found a private medical crew ready to work not only for money but for their own reasons. The driver, again Jaden, had to take over from one of the usual drivers on the chosen night, covering his absence with a fake illness. On paper, Elias would be classified as an accompanying Omega with chronic nervous symptoms, which sounded mundane for a house like this. The weakest link, as always, was people. Liam knew too well how fear could wipe out any perfect scheme. He had seen Omegas who, given the chance to leave, walked back into the cage because they couldn't believe it was any better outside. He had seen betas willing to overlook anything for an extra envelope, and those who, on the contrary, reported every strange thing to the boss hoping for promotion. So he told no one the full plan. Jaden knew only his part. Marcus, only his. The doctors, only theirs. Elias, the least of all. He just had to be ready for one night when Liam would walk into his room and say a single word. Now. And then he'd have to go without asking where or why. Liam understood how cruel it was to ask for that much trust from someone trained all his life not to trust anyone. But there was no other way. The closer the chosen date crept, the heavier the pressure became. At night the house sounded the same: laughter, music, muffled voices. But for Liam, every sound had shifted categories, every guard's step a possible schedule glitch, every look from Matthew a potential check. Even a camera's tiny flicker turned into a sign. Here, maybe it would be possible to slip out of sight for a few seconds. At night, lying on the narrow staff bed, he ran the plan again and again in his head. The ambulance drives into the yard. Matthew, drunk and annoyed, doesn't want trouble and lets them process the call on the short form. One Omega on the stretcher. A second, walking beside him, head down, arms pressed to his body, doors shut, gates open, and then 20 or 30 seconds, the longest and shortest stretch of his life. He was afraid, not in some heroic, romanticized way, but truly, physically. His palms sweated, his heart sometimes skipped a beat at just the memory of how, in the police station, the judge's gavel had hit the wood and sealed his old life. But fear didn't change the fact that time was working against Elias. Every extra month in Vane's house left new, invisible scars, and there could come a day when he simply wouldn't want to go, because he'd forgotten what it meant to want anything at all. The date was set. A night when Vane would be out of town. Matthew would traditionally get drunk faster than usual, and the guest list held no one who liked staging surprise discipline checks. All that was left was to wait for the calendar and the house's internal map to line up at one point. With each passing day, footsteps in the corridor echoed louder in Liam's chest, like a countdown ticking inside him. The night he had held in his mind for weeks as an endpoint started almost perfectly. Vane's house hummed in its usual rhythm, music in the hall, muffled laughter, crystal clinking, heavy guard steps at the entrance. Somewhere upstairs, an Omega sobbed quietly into a pillow, thinking no one could hear. Everything was following the script. The first part of the plan went almost without cracks. The Omega who agreed to play the sick one slipped into a convincing panic attack in a corridor where noise was never tolerated. He gasped for air, clawed at the wall, shaking so realistically that even the most cynical staffers went pale. His voice carried not only rehearsed panic, but real fear of what would happen if all this turned out to be for nothing. The staff reacted on autopilot. Call the house doctor, inform the deputy, quick exchange of lines. Matthew, already at that stage where irritation and fatigue mixed with alcohol, wanted nothing less than to get into details. He waved a hand, agreed to call an ambulance on the simple form, tossing only a line about the house not being liable for weak nerves. The planted driver arrived on time. The ambulance rolled into the yard with a soft sound, headlights gliding over the facade, picking out the trimmed garden. Guards at the gate yawned, checked the plates, compared the data with a pre-sent request, and stepped back. The stretcher came out quickly. The crew moved with the confidence of people who'd been to places like this before. Liam was already inside, playing the helper who had to accompany the patient. Elias walked beside them, a little behind, like an Omega used to soothing others in attacks. His eyes still had that familiar emptiness, but under it, something like resolve was finally showing. He didn't ask questions. He just walked. The stretcher was loaded back into the ambulance. The patient groaned at the right moment, blocking part of the view. To security, this looked like standard procedure. Another Omega unable to handle the stress. Documents matched. Signatures went onto forms automatically. The doors were just about to close. Almost. The problem walked into the yard as a pair of footsteps. A late guest who had stayed longer than expected. An alpha with a heavy, sticky smell of expensive tobacco and old deals. No one expected him at that moment, but he'd come back for a forgotten briefcase and one more hit of good mood. His attention was drawn not to the ambulance itself, but to the combination of details. The late hour, Matthew's boozy voice, the too tight silence around the vehicle, Liam's glance, lingering for a heartbeat too long on the gate. The alpha stopped, listened to the air, and looked more closely at what others had learned not to see. His voice cut across the yard like a knife. Stop. That one calm, level word instantly flipped the rhythm of everything happening. Guards tensed. Matthew tried to smile, muttering something about another meltdown. But the guest was already heading toward the ambulance, each step sounding like a countdown. He demanded they pull back the blanket over the patient. For staff, that was unusual. Usually no one asked questions. The less they knew, the better. But refusing would draw suspicion from a man whose opinion Vane valued. The stretcher stopped. The paramedic stiffened inside, but his hands stayed steady. Liam felt the air in his chest turning into glass. The blanket lifted. Instead of the familiar face of the Omega who was supposed to be on that stretcher, under it was a disguised staffer, too solid to play someone broken. That was enough. The guest's eyes narrowed. The old habit of spotting inconsistencies clicked in immediately. His gaze swept over the faces around him, landed on Liam, then on Elias. Elias stood too close, too taut, like someone clinging to his only lifeline. The next second, everything collapsed. The guest barked a short order at the guards, the kind that always thickened the house's air. The internal alarm didn't howl immediately, but the call to the security post went through at once. Doors began locking automatically. Heavy panels dropped down almost silently, only a fine metal scrape betraying that the house was sliding into lockdown. One guard lunged at Liam, grabbing him hard by the shoulder. The blow wasn't aimed at his body so much as at what he represented. "How dare you!" Liam flew into the side of the ambulance. Pain exploded in his ribs. A slow, burning taste of blood filled his mouth. For a moment, the world went black and red, but he stayed conscious. He saw another guard already reaching for Elias, trying to yank him out of this scene and drag him back to where he belonged. Instinct kicked in faster than fear. Liam lunged forward, shoving himself between the guard and the judge's son, as if his body could change the balance. They hit him again, this time to knock the breath out of him. He dropped to his knees, hands sliding over the gravel, but even from that position, he kept searching for Elias with his eyes, giving him a tiny nod toward the only remaining gap, a narrow passage between the garages where one camera always lagged. Jaden, standing by the driver's door, understood at once that the plan had blown. There was no heroism on his face, only sharp, calculating tension. He caught Liam's look and flicked his chin in the same direction, but he didn't get to move. The guest was already shouting for the exits to be sealed, and 2 guards sprinted toward the outbuildings. The house began to sound like a trap. Doors thudded into lock, footsteps multiplied. Somewhere an Omega screamed, feeling something terrible was happening without seeing it. The alarm system, usually aimed inward, now pulsed outward. At that same time, in another part of the city, in an office with high windows and perfectly aligned piles of files, a secure phone on the handler's channel started to vibrate. Adrian didn't look up from the paperwork at once. Outwardly, his day was indistinguishable from any other. Hearings, discussions of new projects, signing the latest verdicts. On his desk lay cases where Omegas were turning into lines and his signature into a stamp closing off their way back. He was already sick of his own handwriting, but he kept writing because the system expected it of him. Marcus's message was shorter than he had feared. Plan failed. House in lockdown. Liam and Elias in immediate danger. Time is measured in minutes. Everything inside him clenched. For a moment the judge just sat without breathing, feeling how every word in that short line cracked his carefully constructed world like glass. He had thought he was ready for this, that somewhere deep down he had always kept an everything goes wrong scenario in mind. Reality was heavier. 2 very specific faces rose in his mind, not abstract figures, but painfully clear images. Liam in the courtroom, standing in the cage, crumpled and stubborn, and little Elias on an old video, reaching out his hands to him, still unaware that the mere fact of his birth was already wrong in the world's eyes. The choice in front of him was simple in its wording and explosive in its consequences. He could pull back, tell himself he'd done everything he could, that the risk was too great, that no one would ever know he'd even tried. He could keep his seat, his status, his mask of the untouchable judge who never breaks rules he protects, or step somewhere his status alone would no longer be enough to shield him. The option of retreat was all too familiar. He had chosen it when he hid his son, when he signed sentences against Omegas, telling himself, the law demands it. When he closed his eyes to rumors of houses like Vane's, because officially, nothing had been proven. Each time he saved something, his career, his reputation, the illusion of controlling the system. Each time, others paid for it. Now, the ones paying were those whose names he couldn't cross out of his heart. If he intervened openly, the structure of his life would crack. Any raid on Vane's house would drag into daylight what had been buried for years under charity and private events. Names of clients would come out, many very respectable families. People would ask who had launched this, find out why this particular judge had pushed so hard for a search warrant. They'd dig up the strange disappearance of convicted Omega Liam, find traces of his transfer to a closed program no one had officially approved. His own part in the story would no longer be that of a hero in robes. He'd become the man who'd spent years signing sentences, and then, when trouble touched him personally, started fighting the system he had reinforced. Society does not like such mirrors, but there was one but in that picture that grew heavier than all the arguments. His son, not as some abstract heir, not as a checkbox on a resume, as a living Omega who might be standing in a corridor right now, surrounded by guards with no adult left whose words he could lean on. And Liam, who had gone into that house instead of serving out his term because the judge had asked him, because he had believed at least one promise from the system. For the first time in many years, Adrian allowed himself a motive that wasn't pure or noble. He dropped the pretense of wanting to save everyone. In that moment, he wanted to save 2 people, his son, and the man he had used. His hands moved faster than his thoughts. He grabbed the phone and dialed a prosecutor he had once helped bury a doctored evidence case. His voice lacked its usual cold dignity. There was only a dry order backed by fear and resolve. He talked about houses where people without documents were being held, about illegal medical procedures, about violence wrapped in status. He had materials that had previously been brushed off as inadmissible in court. Now they turned into grounds for an emergency warrant. Next, he called the head of a special unit he'd once crossed paths with on someone else's blunder. That man understood that raiding a place like Vane's wasn't routine. It was a step against a web of money, power, and connections. But in the judge's voice, he heard something almost never heard from someone of his rank. They might die there tonight, not as a figure of speech, but as a simple fact. Putting the phone down, Adrian remained alone for a moment in his office's silence. He understood he had just ripped off his own mask. By morning, the news would likely talk about unprecedented law enforcement activity in the home of a respected philanthropist. And by evening, people would ask who had ordered it and what that judge was hiding. But there was no going back. A few hours later, when the city was still under darkness, a line of vehicles rolled toward Vane's house. Not a quiet ambulance anymore, but heavy vans with the insignia of special units and the prosecutor's office. The gate, used to swinging open for guest cars, now faced steel and law, not party spirits. A system that had grown used to impunity heard for the first time in a long while the sound it feared most. The synchronized footfall of people who'd come not to be entertained, but to break things. For Adrian, it meant the end of his old life. For Liam and Elias, no guarantee of rescue, but a chance. And a chance, in a world where Omegas had lived for years without a right to choose, was already a luxury. The first shot sounded like a crack in glass, too sharp for the mansion's usual nighttime noise. For a moment, Liam decided some guest had started another domination game, but commands followed the shot, short, clipped, foreign to this house. Then another burst, a dull echo under the ceiling, a scream, a heavy thud of a body against a wall. Even the air changed flavor. He was lying on the cold corridor floor, still feeling the deep ache in his ribs and mouth. The metallic taste of blood mixed with the scent of perfume and alcohol still hanging from the party. Next to him, shaking with fine tremors, stood Elias. His eyes were wide, pupils almost black. Each new sound made his body jerk like from an electric shock, but his legs held their line. He stayed at Liam's side. The house, once sounding like carefully composed music, laughter, soft steps, hushed conversations, turned into a cacophony. Heavy boots on marble, the crunch of doors being forced open, someone's shriek, an Omega caught in a room where she had just been used, guards shouting, trying to protect the master and their own skins at once. Upstairs came the crash of glass and a short, desperate scream cut off halfway. Orders from the special unit cut the air. On the ground, face down, hands where I can see them. Liam had heard that tone only on TV, in news coverage of raids in other districts. He had never thought he'd be on this side. The unit moved fast and methodically. Teams hit several entries at once. Some smashed the main doors. Others hit service entrances, the very ones used to bring in Omegas and staff away from guests' eyes. The house, built around one man's control, was not ready for attack from multiple fronts. The guards tried to mount a defense, but their confusion showed in every move. They were used to the scariest person here being Vane, not men in helmets holding warrants. A few bodies in black lay against the walls, wrists cinched with plastic ties, their faces showing not just fear, but pure shock that their usual untouchability had just evaporated. Omegas scattered through the house reacted differently. Some, seeing men in armor and masks, automatically dropped their eyes and braced for punishment. Some lunged forward, trying to grab at anyone who didn't smell like a guest. Others just froze like Elias, unable to tell how this new force differed from the old one. For them, any loud outside force meant the same thing. Someone else was making decisions over them again. Liam saw a group of operators burst in from a side door. They moved in short rushes, steps crisp. One pointed his weapon at them, at Liam and Elias, on the floor. Both of you. Reflex kicked in before thought. Liam raised his hands, showing he wasn't a threat. Elias, confused, turned to the wall, pressing his back to it, his eyes still fixed on the shattered entrance. Liam wanted to shout that they weren't guards, but his voice broke into a cough. Blood filled his throat again. Luckily, one of the operators held his gaze a moment longer than usual. Uniforms change people, but not completely. Something like doubt flashed in his eyes. He saw not armed enemies, but two thin figures with no weapons, in house clothes, with visible bruises. The muzzle dipped a little, but the command came again, firmer. On the ground. No stupid moves. Liam dropped first, showing Elias this wasn't a fall he needed to fear. Hands behind his head, cheek pressed to the cold tile. Elias followed a moment later, shivering but obedient. For an Omega raised to obey orders, there was no difference between lie down for punishment and lie down for your safety. He just did as he was told. After that, everything came in jerks like a bad dream. They were pulled up and led down a corridor that had recently echoed with the rustle of expensive suits and the clink of ice in glasses. Now, overturned vases, scattered personal things, and someone's shoes lay along the walls. In the middle of the mess sat an Omega in a glittering dress, staring at one spot, not reacting to screams or footsteps. Two operators passed carrying a man in an unbuttoned shirt, yelling that everyone here was voluntary. Metal cuffs already gleamed on his wrists. They took Richard Vane down quickly and almost casually. Liam saw him only in passing in one of the halls. Without the polished smile and host's mannerisms, he looked older than in the photos. His eyes darted, but his voice still tried to keep its old line. He spoke of a club based on mutual consent, of contracts, of how everyone here had allegedly chosen. Pre-prepared folders lay on the table, defense arguments already written. But this time, it wasn't enough. The officer showing him the warrant didn't bother to listen to the long speech. Behind him stood people ready to seize servers, safes, personal devices. In private rooms they found what no contract could hide. Omegas with tear-swollen eyes whose hormones had been carefully adjusted for obedience for years. Medical logs noting needed doses for those who resisted. Photos from parties where some faces were blurred, but captions weren't. Chats where guests discussed fresh stock and their preferred types. Documents that had sounded like rumor now became evidence. Somewhere in this chaos, Adrian walked in. No robe, no press theater, just dark clothes, a vest under his jacket, the look of a man torn between protocol and his own fear. For many, seeing him there was a shock. Officers used to seeing him only behind a high bench stumbled over formal titles. Prosecutors straightened up, feeling the weight of what was happening. He walked down the corridor still smelling of powder, alcohol, and fear, and saw in real life what he had long refused to see in files. An Omega tugging a robe over a torn dress, a beta waiter pressing trembling hands to his chest, a guard face down on the floor with handcuffs and a look full of resentment and confusion. All of it had once passed his eyes as lines like disturbance of public order, personal initiative, no corpus delicti. Now every line had a face. He saw Liam and Elias at the exit when they were lining them up with the others being escorted out. His heart reacted faster than his mind. For a second, all his roles, judge, system representative, raid organizer, fell away. There were only two figures left, the Omega he had sentenced and the young man whose eyes he'd recognize from any distance, even if he had never had the right to call him his son. An officer not privy to details stepped in front of them. He held up a tablet and spoke in the flat tone used to announce procedure. Liam recognized the words at once. Prisoner status, unserved term, unclear circumstances of presence in the house. The suggestion, really an order, to escort him not to the witness transport but to a separate van for detainees. It was all logical. The system knew him as a convicted Omega. For it, he wasn't the one who risked his life to drag someone out of hell, but just another socially dangerous body. At one point, the officer, reading off the document, said the familiar dry phrase, Omega Liam Blake is to be returned to a correctional facility. It hit his ears like cold water. Everything was in that sentence, the automatism, the indifference, the exact same tone he had heard in court when they'd first given him his term. As if everything that had happened since, the cell, the nighttime deal, Vane's house, had just been noise that didn't change the main point. Elias jerked. For the first time in a long while, something like a real emotion flared in his eyes. He didn't fully understand the legal language, but he heard the intonations. Someone was about to take away the only support he had. That was the moment Adrian stepped in. He came close enough that his voice no longer sounded like a distant top-down order. For the first time in years, his intonation wasn't icy. It was raw, a little torn at the edges. He addressed the officer first, briefly and by the book, stating that he didn't have all the information, asked for the tablet, scanned the data he himself had once signed, then looked up, and the wall behind his gaze was gone. "You are not taking this Omega away as a criminal," he said, and those few words carried more disruption than all his speeches from the bench. The officer, forgetting himself for a moment, tried to argue, citing the sentence. For him, paper was the law and the face was an attachment. But the judge, who had once hidden behind stamps and formulas, now dragged them into the light. He essentially admitted, in front of everyone, that this decision was his personal responsibility. That he was the one who had sent Liam to prison. That he was the one who had involved him in an operation that had led them all here. For the first time, Liam heard himself called not defendant or socially dangerous, but a man who helped expose a criminal network. That word, man, sounded so unfamiliar that for a moment everything seemed to hush. Then Adrian said the thing he'd feared most his entire life. He called Elias his son, not in a whisper, not behind a closed door, not in a confession that could be denied, in an out-loud sentence where, along with the legal phrasing, lay bare, unpracticed vulnerability. "This Omega is my son." And the man standing next to him saved his life. The phrases broke down into simple, almost everyday pieces, but together they hit the old order like a hammer. The judge, known for his harshness toward Omegas, was suddenly the father of a hidden Omega. The judge who'd shattered others' lives in the name of the law now admitted that an Omega had corrected his own mistake. Someone in the line of staff flinched, someone pretended not to hear. But it was already too late. Down the corridor, behind the operators' backs, a camera lens flashed. Despite the cordon, some reporter had managed to push closer than planned. A tired, confused guard hadn't blocked the passage in time. For a few seconds, while no one reacted, the lens captured everything. Liam's face, bruised, unshaven, with blood on his lips. Pale Elias, who wouldn't look away from the judge. Adrian himself, knocked out of his usual perfect composure. That image was impossible in the old world's logic. It broke too many rules at once. Outside, the noise was rising. TV vans lined up along the fence, reporters shouting into microphones, trying to fish for statements. One or two managed to record a few seconds of people being led out wrapped in blankets, eyes down. In those faces, news anchors didn't yet see stories, just sensation. Inside, the raid went on. Documents went into boxes, servers were unplugged and carried out, doors were sealed shut with red tape. Investigators in gloves slipped flash drives, notebooks, and phones into evidence bags. What had once been private territory for people like Vane was now material for trials. But even amid that scale, the core came down to a simple, deeply personal scene in a corridor. A judge who had spent years playing a machine suddenly revealed himself as a man whose mask had cracked. An Omega whom the system had tagged as a model convict turned out to be the one who led it to where it hadn't wanted to look. A son who had been hidden as a shameful secret was now living proof that no name or wall protects you from violence if you're born in the wrong status. The naked truth didn't look heroic. It was awkward, raw, often ugly. There was too much late remorse and too little pre-planned nobility in it. And that was exactly why it was stronger than any narrative they had carefully built around men like Adrian before. The system could no longer pretend that nothing had happened, even if she wanted it very much. After the raid, Vane's house stopped existing as a closed territory, but the war didn't go anywhere. It just changed its scenery. Instead of marble floors and dim hall lights, there were now news screens, committee hearings, long articles with photos where faces were blurred, but the silhouettes were recognizable to anyone who had ever been in places like that. Vane's team worked fast. Even before the first Omegas had time to testify, pseudo-analytical TV shows hit the air, where smooth voices spoke of a conspiracy. In those versions of events, everything looked different. There was no human trafficking, only closed adult clubs based on mutual consent. There was no systemic exploitation, only a sad but rare mistake of a few employees. Elias was painted as a spoiled favorite who had grown tired of discipline. Liam, as a criminal provocateur planted in the house in advance by Vane's enemies. The footage of the notoriously harsh judge talking about his Omega son was cut out and looped endlessly. They attached commentary from paid experts who droned on about conflicts of interest, emotional instability, and dangerous blending of personal and professional. The words about a long-standing system of abuse and human trafficking quietly slid into the background. Front and center remained a simple, convenient picture. The judge snapped because someone found his weak spot. Adrian's colleagues reacted in different ways. Some pretended nothing extraordinary had happened. In the courthouse corridors, they discussed the weather, traffic, the latest reforms, carefully skirting the topic of Vane's house and the fact that their own colleague had ended up at the center of the scandal. Others, on the contrary, waited for his mistakes like carrion birds circling a wounded animal. For them, his act was a gift, a pretext to finally knock off the pedestal the man who had set the tone for years. The formal blow came quickly. One day, Adrian was summoned to a disciplinary hearing. The room where judicial fates were usually decided looked deliberately neutral. Pale walls, a long table, a few microphones, a glass carafe of water. But the air inside was thick and viscous. It smelled of fear for their own chairs and carefully covered hatred of any deviation from the line. In essence, he was about to become the defendant inside the very system he had served for decades. The charges were phrased in dry language: abuse of powers in initiating the raid, conflict of interest due to personal involvement, violation of the code of impartiality. Behind every clause stood the same thought no one voiced out loud. We could have kept looking the other way if you had stayed quiet. At first, Adrian answered as usual. First, Adrian. In a calm, measured tone, he described the grounds for the search, referred to the materials he'd received, sheltered himself behind legal logic. But the further the questions went, the clearer it became that they expected more than explanations. They were offering him a way back under the old roof, to admit that he had simply acted out of emotion, that he'd been wrong, that he'd gone too far. And then, maybe, the system could remain almost exactly as it had been. At some point, he caught himself repeating the same phrases he had once used to justify his own sentences. The need to maintain order. A signal to society. Strict measures in the name of protecting the majority. The words sounded hollow now. They had no substance left. He no longer saw abstract omegas in his mind, but specific faces. A boy crying in the corridor after his sentence was read. A woman holding her younger brother's hand as she was sent into isolation. And now, Elias and Liam led out of Vane's house with other people's hands still marked on their skin. The silence in the hearing room grew heavier when one of the senior members of the commission asked a question that was both accusation and bait. Why now, Judge Crawford? Why only when the matter affected you personally? It was a moment when he could have hidden once more behind a formula about a convergence of circumstances. He could have said that new information had emerged, that the situation had changed, that public pressure had increased. Instead, for the first time in many years, he chose words that hadn't been pre-processed. He said he had been afraid that if he publicly acknowledged the existence of an Omega son, he would lose not only his career, but also the levers of protection he had for once tried to use not to break someone, but to save him. Afraid of his colleagues' looks, the press's contempt, the cold analysis of the same experts now dissecting him on air. Afraid that his name would stop being a shield and become a brand. He admitted that for many years he had handed down harsh sentences to Omegas, not because he believed more in their guilt than in the guilt of Alphas, but because he knew a broken Omega could never threaten the system. It had seemed to him that this way he was reinforcing order. In reality, He had been cementing a mechanism in which his own son became the perfect victim. "I was part of the machine," he said once quietly, without pathos. "My decisions made it smoother and harsher, and only when that machine drove all the way to my own door did I admit that it breaks more than just other people's locks." These confessions didn't fit neatly into the protocol as legal text. They tried to frame them with careful formulations, but the meaning no longer depended on that. For some in the room, it sounded like betrayal. Their eyes said, "You sold us out." For others, it was like something they themselves had been turning away from inside for many years. The question of his position hung between the lines. No one pronounced a verdict right away. Times had changed enough that simply throwing him out of the system was dangerous. Society already knew too much. But keeping him in his old capacity, in the robe of the infallible, was impossible. He understood that. And for the first time, he did not try to fight for the chair. His mind was occupied by a different trial, the one he was holding for himself every time he woke up at night and remembered the case lists bearing his signature. While he was going through these hearings, Liam and Elias were living in another parallel world. They were placed in a secure center where the walls were painted in soothing colors, where there were no gilded frames or cameras on the ceiling. Instead, there were doors that locked from the inside, not from the outside. It smelled of medicine, vending machine coffee, and other people's stories stored in folders marked confidential. Mornings began with doctors making their rounds. Medical staff trained in trauma care asked questions, listened, took notes. For Elias, the very idea that someone would ask how he felt was alien. He was better at guessing others' wishes than articulating his own. In the first sessions, he kept silent, staring at the floor, automatically picking the answers he thought would please. Only when the psychologist calmly said, "You don't need to be convenient here," did something inside him shift. Liam treated therapists with suspicion. Too often in his life, people who asked lots of questions turned out to be cops, journalists, or those who collected information to use later. But the center played by different rules. No one demanded a confession in an hour. No one said he was obligated to cooperate if he wanted help. They only wanted one thing from him, that he stop constantly waiting for a blow. The days all looked the same on the surface, but a lot happened inside each one. Elias was learning simple things, to say, "I'm tired," instead of enduring to the limit, to notice when he was frightened and when things were just unfamiliar, to understand that not every touch meant danger. Liam was getting used to not leaping to his feet at every loud sound. He allowed himself to close his eyes for more than a few minutes without checking where the nearest exit was. In the evenings, they sometimes turned the news on in the common room. The sound was kept low so as not to overload those still learning to live without constant stress. But even with the volume down, Liam and Elias heard the important parts. Reports about Vane's case, snippets of the disciplinary hearings, expert commentary. Clips of Adrian speaking not as a mechanism, but as a man. Once Liam noticed the moment when Elias, who had previously avoided any talk about the judge, let his gaze linger on the screen. They were showing a short fragment of his speech, the one where he admitted, "I hid my son out of fear." There was no instant forgiveness in Elias's eyes, no bright accusation either, only a heavy, complicated realization the man whose decisions had wrecked his life was at least trying to call it what it was. For Liam, watching this process was its own kind of torture and relief. He saw the high courts cautiously, carefully, discussing someone they had recently held up as an example. He heard Omega activists on talk shows using the judge's admission to finally speak about systemic responsibility. He heard his own name appearing in the news, not just on a list of convicts, but in the context of someone who helped expose a criminal network. That didn't erase what had happened before. It didn't cancel nights in a cell, pain in his side, fear in Vane's corridors. But it added another layer. He was no longer just a victim or just a tool. He was now a witness in a process where one of the system's architects had, for the first time, voluntarily sat down at the table and said, "I was wrong." The case against Adrian officially dragged on. Hearings were postponed, decisions delayed. Commissions wrote reports, lawyers argued over wording. But the main verdict had already been rendered, and not by the disciplinary board. The judge's own conscience, finally given the right to speak, would never again allow him to return to his old life, even if every protocol magically cleared his name. At first, their stay in the center seemed to Liam like a temporary reprieve, something like a sterile corridor between two cells. But days passed, weeks strung themselves together, and he realized more and more clearly. The danger was no longer at the door, but inside. Where the roles of savior and saved ended, something much harder began, the need to be himself without hiding behind a mission or fear. Elias reacted to relative freedom like someone who had clung to a handrail in a storm for too long. When the rocking suddenly stopped, his body still kept searching for support. The very first day without a schedule and orders knocked him off balance more than any of Vane's screams. They left him in a room with a soft blanket, a small choice of books, and the option to come to the common room if he wanted to. Paradoxically, it was the absence of pressure that triggered his anxiety. He sat on the bed for a long time, not daring even to open the wardrobe. There were clothes inside that hadn't been picked by a stylist, and that in itself felt too strange. Old algorithms lined up automatically in his head. Ask for permission, clarify what's allowed and what isn't, wait for instructions. But no one came in. The door stayed closed only from the inside, and that silent freedom was more terrifying than the most luxurious rooms in Vane's house. Liam came from chaos of another kind. His childhood and youth in the lower districts had never given him a sense of safety, but they had taught him to improvise. Where Elias froze, Liam instinctively looked for a point of action. In the center, he didn't force himself on him, but stayed within arm's reach, not as a bodyguard or hero, but as someone who knew the value of each tiny step. He would show up in the doorway when the anxiety inside Elias rose to that familiar, dull roar. He didn't ask if he was ready to talk. He just left a mug of tea on the nightstand, sat down in a chair, and kept quiet. Sometimes he said the simplest thing. I didn't know what to do on the first day either. Sometimes that alone was enough for the tension in Elias's shoulders to ease just a little. Slow healing rarely looks like a clean line. It was more like a fragile, jagged mood chart. One day, Elias would find the courage to go to the common room, sit in a far corner, and listen to others talk about their stories. The next day, he would shut down, turn his face to the wall, and find himself unable to endure a single question from the psychologist. Liam didn't try to force him into stability at any cost. He knew from his own experience, the road out of a cage can't be straight. Their conversations picked their own pace. At first, they were fragments of phrases, almost incidental observations. Liam talked about the cheap cafe he'd worked at before his arrest, the perpetually broken coffee machine, the regulars who left coins and gossip, about night delivery shifts when the city smelled of wet concrete and exhaustion, about how an omega from the street was always counting, how many steps to the nearest exit, how many seconds it would take to wrench your hand out of someone's grip. Elias listened like someone learning a language he'd never heard before. His childhood had been different. Private schools where he was never shown in group photos, teachers who treated him with exaggerated formality as if afraid of getting too close, rooms with no trace of him, no drawings on the walls, no random souvenirs. Every object was functional and impersonal. Hormone regimes scheduled down to the hour, doctors talking about him in the third person even when he sat right there. They discovered that they had grown up in different scenery, but under the same rules. Both had learned that any expression of "I want" was dangerous. Liam had that hammered into him with direct threats. Elias, with a soft but relentless, "This is better for everyone." The feelings that began to surface between them did not fit any known pattern. This wasn't the kind of spark that sometimes flares in tight spaces where two bodies are pressed together by adrenaline and fear. Back in Vane's house, any warmth had been suspicious. Behind it almost always lurked a demand, a deal, a hidden cost. Here, in the center, emotions weren't followed by immediate demands for payment, and that, more than anything, made them frightening. One evening after a heavy group session, when the psychologist had asked everyone to name at least one thing they wanted for themselves, Elias came out looking pale. The word "want" had lodged in his throat, never quite turning into a sentence. In the hallway, he practically bumped into Liam, who was waiting for his turn. "I don't know how to do that," he blurted out. Liam didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. He simply suggested a walk in the inner courtyard. In the evening, it was cool and quiet there, the lamplight only outlining the trees. They walked side by side without touching, and that simple movement was already a step toward something bigger than patient. Over time, they developed rituals no specialist had prescribed. Morning tea that Liam brought not because therapy recommended it, but because it was at least one predictable element in an unpredictable day. A brief check-in at night. Are we both still here? Are we still holding up? Sharing impressions after the news, what each of them had heard, what had hit hardest. Liam noticed how Elias's body changed during sessions. At first, every touch from a doctor caused a micro-flinch, a subtle recoil, almost invisible but palpable. Later, when he himself asked for Liam to sit beside him during the hardest sessions, the freeze phase turned into something else. He'd squeezed Liam's fingers so hard they turned white, but he wouldn't dissociate. As if he were holding onto himself through another person's hand. For Liam, that was both difficult and healing. He had long been used to surviving alone, counting on no one's support. Now, his presence had become someone else's anchor. And this role hadn't been imposed by circumstances as in Vane's house, where he had protected Elias because the alternative was simple collapse. Here, he could have stepped back, said no, cited exhaustion. But he didn't. His own body also slowly came out of permanent combat readiness. The first nights in the center felt like night shifts in prison. Liam woke at every rustle, checked the door, automatically counted the steps to the window. Over time, he began allowing himself to sleep deeper. Once he caught himself waking, not from fear, but from a quiet knock. Elias stood in the hallway holding a blanket, looking almost guilty. "I'm scared," he said then, surprised at the fact he'd said it out loud. There were 2 beds in the room, but they spent that night in one, lying a handspan apart. There were no gestures that could be read as trying to take advantage of the moment. There was only shared breathing and a strange sense that beside you was someone you weren't obligated to save, but wanted to keep in the warmth of your presence. Their new closeness was built on the ability to say no. That was especially unfamiliar. In a world where any no from an Omega was treated as a glitch in the program, refusal felt like a crime. The staff at the center repeated insistently, "You have the right not to agree." But only in small practical things did that rule become real. They practiced saying no, even to therapists. Once Liam gently but firmly stopped a specialist who was pushing too hard for details about intimate episodes in Vane's house. He said he wasn't ready. Not because he didn't trust them, but because it was too soon. And he heard in response not a threat or reproach, but a simple, "Okay, we'll come back to it later if you want." One day, Elias refused to take part in a group exercise where they were supposed to act out healthy relationship scenes. He said that, to him, it sounded like a bad joke for now. Instead, he and Liam spent an hour in an empty music room, just hitting keys on an old piano. Neither of them knew how to play, but the mere right to make noise without being scolded felt almost sacrilegious. Adrian, in the meantime, existed in their lives like a man on the threshold. He didn't burst into the center with his old, agile confidence. On the contrary, his movements had grown tentative. He only came with the therapist's approval, no more often than the recovering process allowed. Meetings took place in neutral rooms whose walls did not remember his robe or sentences. Every time he saw Elias sitting a bit closer to Liam than he had allowed himself before, the judge felt a sharp, almost physical stab. It was a mix of jealousy at someone else's ability to be there and gratitude that this someone else existed at all. He spoke little. Mostly he listened, and he learned to accept that the support he had failed to give his son as a child was now being provided by the man he had once publicly sent to prison. For Liam, Adrian's presence was a test from another angle. In this one person, 2 irreconcilable figures were joined, the one who had taken his freedom for the sake of a public example, and the one who had risked everything to haul Elias out of hell. Reconciling those images in his head was hard, but each time he saw the judge lower his gaze instead of smothering his guilt in talk of complex circumstances, some of Liam's inner hardness softened. Slow healing did not promise a fairy tale ending. Trauma doesn't vanish just because you discuss it long enough. It changes shape. It stops being the sole center of life and becomes a background you can live with. Liam and Elias still woke up in a cold sweat sometimes, still flinched from touch, still argued with therapists and with themselves. But between the anxiety spikes, new episodes appeared that had never existed in either of their worlds. Laughter over some silly kitchen incident at the center, a spontaneous conversation about the future framed not as, if they lock us up again, but as, where would you like to go if things get easier? They still didn't call each other partners, didn't make forever promises, didn't build grand plans. But their new roles were obvious without words. They had stopped being only victim and rescuer. They had become something far more dangerous to the old system. Two Omegas who had endured and dared to look at each other not through the prism of someone else's power, but through their own slowly recovering choice. Enough time passed for the news feeds to switch to fresh scandals, new cases, new big names, but not enough for the story of Vane's house to dissolve in the general noise. It settled deeper, in layers lived by lawyers, activists, those who were used to reading not just headlines but the fine print. The prosecution of Vane dragged on. At some point, it even began to resemble the usual spectacle. Defense attorneys constructing intricate theories about voluntary participation, producing contracts where consent was carefully phrased. Some defendants did get real terms, and behind bars ended up people convinced their money outweighed any law. Some cases fell apart, as expected. Some bought experts, some conveniently disappeared. But the main impact was not in the number of sentences, but in the fact that the scheme itself had been recognized as criminal. The house that for decades had been considered a closed club for insiders was officially called what it had always been, a place of systematic abuse. That precedent slowly reshaped the landscape. Omega support centers that had previously survived on grants and sheer enthusiasm suddenly received more funding and legal backing. A few judges who had witnessed the inner workings of Adrian's disciplinary case reconsidered their approach in matters where Omegas were being cast as the only guilty party. The protocols still contained plenty of cold phrasing, but for the first time in a long while, some decisions began to mention context, pressure, inequality between the sides. It was not a revolution, more like a small push that nudged the tracks in a direction that hadn't existed before. Adrian lost the robe. The official wording was neutral, almost sterile. Voluntary resignation in the wake of loss of confidence among some colleagues. That sentence didn't contain the late-night visit to a cell or the raid on a house many had thought untouchable. But for him, things were simpler and harsher. He no longer had the right to sit above others and speak in the name of the law. And that was fair. In exchange, he received another role. A human rights organization took him in, one he had previously only encountered in court on the opposite side of the barricades. Now his experience was used as a tool turned the other way. Where he had once helped the system keep its facade, he began to look for cracks. He read cases where Omegas and Betas were labeled socially dangerous, found flaws in the charges, tipped off defense lawyers about where to press and where to back off. Each person he helped avoid an unjust sentence was a small but real payment on his debt. He did not expect forgiveness, not from Elias, not from Liam, not from those whose names were still buried in his old verdicts. He didn't try to justify himself with stories about the pressure of circumstances or the norms of the era. On the rare evenings he was alone, he admitted to himself honestly, no amount of future work would erase what he had already signed. But to stop now would be to admit that the story with Vane's house had been a single flash of conscience. He couldn't allow himself that luxury. For Liam and Elias, life after the center was not a straight road into the light. They didn't leave the program for a perfect seaside apartment and vanish into a happy ending. They had to deal with far more mundane questions: where to live, what to lean on, how to react to a world still full of people who considered Omegas expendable. At first, they stayed at the center as part of a follow-up program, not as patients, but as those who had walked the path and were now ready to walk beside others. From that role, a small, almost invisible project emerged, a dedicated space for people leaving closed houses who had no idea how life outside actually worked. Liam handled the practical side. He made sure every newcomer had not only therapy, but a mattress to sleep on, documents that hadn't been taken by their former owners, basic money for food. He remembered all too well what it felt like to stand at a dormitory door with a bag of clothes and the understanding that no one owed you anything anymore. He sat with people in lines at government offices, explained what a signature at the bottom of a page meant, showed them how not to let themselves be pressured into another exploitative contract. Elias took another line of work. He talked, not as a psychologist with a diploma and professional distance, but as someone who knew the price of silence. He held small sessions about how to recognize abuse when it's hidden in care, about how the phrase, "this is for your own good," sounds when control is concealed behind it, about how not to rush decisions if the world suddenly offers too much freedom all at once. Sometimes he wrote things down, posting anonymous stories online so that those who weren't yet ready to leave their own houses could recognize themselves in someone else's words. Their romantic connection grew somewhere between these tasks. There was no single day when they solemnly decided, "We're a couple now." No confessions in the rain, no grand gestures. There was a morning when Liam noticed he automatically set out 2 mugs even if Elias was running late. An evening when Elias realized he always messaged Liam first whenever a piece of news upset or delighted him. A conversation where they discussed not their traumas but their plans for the next year, and for the first time said, "we," not out of fear but out of habit. There were plenty of conflicts too. Some days, Elias shut down and every touch felt threatening. Some nights, Liam snapped at people who had nothing to do with his past because a single phrase hid old scars too accurately. But the key lay in how they came back from those breaks. Not with the old, "it's my fault, do whatever you want with me," not with cold detachment, but with heavy, honest admissions. "I'm scared. I'm not coping. I'm not against you right now. I'm against what happened before." That was where a new system of coordinates was born. Before, an omega was always at the bottom of the chart. Any upward movement was only possible with permission from someone higher on the social ladder. A judge, a master, an employer, an alpha partner defined where north and south were, what counted as success and what as a violation. Liam and Elias had lived in different versions of that model, but with the same result. Their personal "I want" never made it onto any axis. Now, the center was shifting. This didn't mean the world suddenly became safe. On the contrary, the more they learned about houses like veins, the clearer the scale of the problem became. But they had something they'd never had before, the ability to choose their own frame of reference. They could turn down a successful project if they smelled the old bargain in it, even if it promised money and connections. They could say no to reporters begging for slightly more dramatic details for ratings. They could refuse to work with organizations that were ready to use omegas as living shields in someone else's political games. Sometimes they were invited to closed seminars for judges and police officers. There, at tables set with water and neatly lined pens, sat people who, not long ago, would have had no trouble signing a showcase sentence like the one Liam once received. They weren't monsters. They were part of a system that had taught them that harshness was the best way to maintain order. In those rooms, Liam told his story without embellishment. Elias spoke about what the life of a child hidden for the sake of a career looks like, and they watched some listeners' coordinates shift, if only by one careful degree. In the evenings, when their support center closed and the corridors fell quiet, they went back to a small rented apartment nearby. There was nothing showy there. An old couch, a table, a hastily assembled bookcase. In the kitchen lay a battered frying pan Liam stubbornly tried to learn not to burn breakfast in. On the windowsill stood a second-hand palm tree that had already survived several repottings. Sometimes the monotonous sound of dishes or the background murmur of the news brought old memories back up. They remembered that long-ago day in court when Liam stood before a man in a robe and heard in his voice something like a sentence from the universe. Remembered the night in the cell when that same man came without his robe and spoke for the first time as a father, not as a function. Remembered Vane's mansion, where the clink of a glass on marble could mean more for an omega than his own name. Those memories were no longer the only points on the map. They had become part of a complex trajectory that had led them here, to a world where an Omega could not only survive under someone else's rules, but slowly change them. Sometimes that change showed in the simplest way. Another new arrival leaving a closed house not into nothingness, but into a place where they were met as a person, not as stock. Sometimes in something subtler, a judge pausing over an overly harsh sentence and looking for alternatives. The main thing was that no one could ever again convince Liam and Elias that their roles were predetermined. They knew how the old system worked. They knew its smell, its sound, its logic. And that was exactly why they could show others where to strike, so that the illusion of power began to crack. If you listened to this story to the end, thank you. Write in the comments which moment resonated with you the most: the showcase sentence, the secret deal in the cell, the night raid on Vane's house, or the slow healing of Liam and Elias. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel BL Story of Love and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next forbidden BL story. And while you're waiting for a new one, remember, even if the system once turned you into a thing, you still have the right to rewrite your role and become someone who saves not only yourself, but also those the world wrote off a long time ago.